Because the door's in here. Good to go? Okay. Hello, welcome. So our talk is called Creating Thoughtful Representation Through Community Outreach, as you know. My name is Jasmine Heyward. I am a student at Northeastern University, journalism student, minor in international affairs undergraduate. And while I haven't been doing a ton of academic research during this period of studying journalism, other than this one project, this same area is kind of also my focus in my journalistic work, looking at marginalized communities and how are they represented and the equity issues that exist there. And this also in some ways throws back to the research that I closed out my high school studies with, which was on the representation of post-traumatic stress disorder and panic disorder in television.
And my name is Logan Reynolds. I'm an animation major and a game design and art history minor, also at Northeastern. I've been very interested in games and making games as a form of self-expression ever since high school, where me and my friends ended up starting a game design club of our own. And generally, I'm very interested in games as a medium and the boundaries of those, as far as them being very personal with the immersion and allowing for very unique storytelling or avant-garde, just very interested in weird creative games.
So the first thing we're going to start with is kind of why does representation matter and what can it do? So one of those first things is that representation builds empathy. There was a study that came out of University of Georgia by Cynthia Hoffner and Elizabeth Cohen that found that fans of the show Monk, which featured a protagonist with obsessive compulsive disorder, held less negative stereotypes about people with OCD and also felt more willing to interact with people with OCD in their own lives. And these fans also stated that the show was what changed their opinion, and they thought that if other people watched the show, their opinions would change regardless of how familiar they are with OCD. So this is kind of a concrete example of how when you can create accurate and thoughtful representation, it does change how people think about marginalized communities.
And then, in addition to helping build empathy, representation helps people feel seen. This documentary, Gaming in Color, is a little dated now, but is an interesting look at both at queer gamers, both on the maker side and on the consumer side, and how they interact in the space or with other people. And there's a quote from Joey Stern, who is one of the founding members of Geeks Out, which is a nonprofit that works to empower the queer gaming community. And he says, wanting to be included in the Mass Effect game and see myself there is a lot about, I want to play as someone I want to be. I don't want to play as the He-Man macho guy, because that's not me. Where for a lot of people, video games or what distinguishes them as a medium is that sense of immersion and that storytelling, where this story is your own. So then having people that you can relate to at a very personal level kind of furthers that environment or furthers that realism. Representation is also a great way to make your game unique, where kind of the go-to explanation I have for why representation matters is that unique experiences lead to unique characters, which lead to unique games. And speaking of unique games, just to cover some of my favorite examples really quickly, there's Night in the Woods, which has two queer characters, two boyfriends, Angus and Greg, who are some of the main characters in the game. And the game does a really interesting job of having characters with depth, where it showcases their relationship and it doesn't shy away from that in any way, where you can go to Angus if you need to find Greg and vice versa, and they have relationship troubles. But in addition to that, they're not purely defined by their sexuality. They have a lot of complexities and other issues going on outside of their relationship. The Tea Room is also a really interesting game by Robert Yang, who does a lot of experimental games, usually focusing on men and queerness and sexuality. the Tea Room is based on real events that took place during the 1960s, in which police officers filmed in urinals without people's knowledge and ended up arresting people on sodomy charges. So then in the Tea Room, it's an abstraction of this, where it's almost a stealth game where you perform oral sex on men without trying to get caught by the police. But Robert Gang had a lot of his games censored in the past, especially by Twitch. So you suck on the other man's like literal gun, where there's some shotguns or pistols and a variety of weaponry, where he talked about how guns were the one thing he thought wouldn't be censored in any form. So that's a really interesting combination of something very real and harsh, combined with kind of this surreal, almost humor element. Then there's 2064 Read-Only Memories, where it's a point-and-click game where you're talking to a robot that's lost its memory, and you're kind of figuring out all these things about this kind of giant corporation. But what's interesting about this game, it has a lot of queer representation as far as people with different genders and gender expressions and people of different sexualities. But the game almost pushes it further, where there's like cybernetic augmentations and all these future questions about what self-expression means and identity. So it's interesting taking a dystopian look almost of queer values and extending them that way. And then there's Mighty Jelloff, which is by Anna Anthropy, who is most well known for her game Dysphoria, about being a trans woman. But there are also a lot of interesting games she's done about kink in the queer community. And in the Mighty Jelloff, you're playing a woman who is trying to climb this tower to please her mistress, to like prove your worth, where it's a very interesting combination of mechanics and theme, where the game is like very literally quite punishing, where you die thousands of times trying to do it. So it's very interesting how connected the mechanics are to the theming of the game pretty directly, especially for a platformer, which you wouldn't think like would lend itself to the most complex queer relationships.
So throughout this talk, our thesis is going to be kind of that one of the best ways that you can create thoughtful representation is if you talk to people as doing some research before you make the game. And the reason why we believe that is that identities and experiences intersect and they influence each other. So if you are making a game, for example, our game, which we'll talk about in a minute, was about LGBTQ college students. Those people have other experiences that kind of influence how they perceive queerness and how they experience it. From race and ethnicity, to religious background, to where you live, to what industry you want to work in once you graduate from college. And so when you talk to people, you can get a real understanding of how those different experiences intersect. And sometimes when you don't, it can be very easy to accidentally rely on stereotypes that are attached to the one identity because that identity is your only lens.
So how do you talk to these people? How do you actually get to know these people and their unique experiences? Well, for our summer project, which was called Diversifying Representation of Queer Youth in Story-Based Games, we knew we were both frustrated with queer representation, especially in video games, where we felt it wasn't great generally, but then video games seemed to be almost 10 years behind. So through Northeastern Summer Scholars Independent Research Fellowship, we traveled around the country interviewing queer college students about their experiences and just learning about them and their environments and their experiences. And then from these interviews, we made the concept for a game, Queer Frontier, where there are 7 queer characters you can play as. In a normal playthrough, you will play from 3 to 4, where there are chapters in the game. And essentially there will be multiple arguments or conflicts that break out, and whichever side you choose or you side with is the person you play as next. Where the framing device for this is a Connect group, which is essentially our version of Facebook, where we knew we were very interested in social media and how that plays into identity and expression. And we also knew we wanted a bunch of diverse characters from a lot of different backgrounds. So we figured online was one of the best ways to do that. The interface is similar to that of Orwell, if any of you have played it, where you can make posts, you can comment on other people, you can look at people's profiles, where profiles especially were one of our ways of learning more about the characters and building out that kind of lore or that world without stating everything explicitly.
So we interviewed students in 10 cities about identity, school communities, and queer media. We started in Boston, Mass. We are students at Northeastern, so we're based here, and we did some interviews during our proposal process to kind of work out why we thought this was important to have some experience that we could explain when we went to Northeastern to try to get funding for it. Then we spent about a week in Texas visiting Dallas, Waco, College Station, and Austin. And the reason that we spent so much time in Texas is because we wanted to get a more nuanced understanding of what it's like to live somewhere that's a lot of times it's considered very hostile for queer people. And then we went to San Francisco and Palo Alto for the opposite reason. These are places that are often exalted as the best places to live if you are queer. So we wanted to understand the experiences of students living there, especially knowing that it is a very expensive place to live. And then we went to Chicago and Milwaukee to go to the Midwest. Both of these cities have communities because they're big enough cities, but there's not a lot of discussion about what the communities are actually like. And then we finished up in Atlanta, Georgia. We wanted to go to the Southeast, and also Atlanta has a reputation of being a kind of a unifying place for specifically Black people of color, and we wanted to see how that was different and how that community operated. And again, our goal was to understand as many unique experiences and perspectives as possible. By the time we were writing our proposal and deciding where we wanted to go, we already knew that we wanted there to be several playable characters in each run of the game, and we knew that we wanted to look at this digital world. So kind of talking to these people was just to get a sense of real experiences that these people have that we can include in our game. And also, since conflicts are a huge part of our game, we want to get a sense of what are the conflicts that people are seeing that seem to be all over the country. These are things that come up in conversation with queerness.
And there were definitely a lot of things through our traveling and through our interviews that we didn't expect. One of the biggest things was that universities in big progressive cities don't necessarily have the best resources. Where we went to UT Dallas in Texas, which has significantly more queer and trans health resources than a lot of universities in wealthier areas, like even Northeastern where we go, where we found that in the South, kind of conversely, a lot of the universities had really robust resources because there was nowhere else to go for them, where in cities like San Francisco or Boston that are considered more liberal, the schools know they don't have to necessarily provide them because there's a lot of other places students can go.
Also, looking at our demographics, there were some surprises. This was a study where we told people we were doing it and people came to us, so it wasn't necessarily as diverse and representative as we would have liked. But I think just generally in our thinking about gender specifically, there is a key up there. I think when you see the yellow, we talked to 2 people who equally identified with the term cisgender woman and non-binary, where we told people, it wasn't a multiple choice question, people could check multiple. And so that was something we didn't necessarily expect, but thought was really interesting and shows how the understanding of gender can be more complex. And also, as you can see here in the green, we spoke to a lot of non-binary students of color. And in general, non-binary people aren't well represented in media regardless of color, but also I think when we do see non-binary representations in media, there tends to be this prototypical response of someone who is white, thin, conventionally attractive, and very androgynous, and that did not line up with the people we met, so that was something that we wanted to keep in mind as we started designing characters.
So how did these interviews impact our character design for our concept? Well, for one, we knew we wanted to have a polyamorous character and an aromantic character. For those of you who don't know, polyamory is essentially the practice or desire of romantic relationships with more than one partner. with the consent of all partners involved, so essentially not monogamous, where this is often conflated or misconstrued as being the same as open relationships. And while we knew that wasn't the case going into it, there are often preconceived notions about them, about poly relationships being all about sex, or that being one of the motivators. But then we actually found there were a lot of interesting complications that came with this, where we talked to people who were polyamorous but single, who were polyamorous but long distance, or polyamorous in monogamous relationships with monogamous people. So we thought that was really interesting as far as just representation you don't really see. Additionally, we talked to a woman who was aromantic, which also presented unique challenges as far as not really being interested in romantic relationships at all, and the complications that come with conveying that. We also knew both of these groups are also arguably included in LGBT groups, so are often kind of overlooked or forgotten about, so we wanted to kind of showcase them. Similarly, we wanted to showcase a depth with parents, where I feel like often it's showcased as parents being either extremely supportive or vehemently homophobic, where we found there was actually a lot of gray area, where a lot of people talked about their parents being uncomfortable with it, but not necessarily voicing that concern or confronting them directly, in addition to some parents ignoring their children coming out entirely or pretending it wasn't a thing, which was definitely something we didn't really think about going into it.
So then to kind of think about these same considerations with our plot, the first thing was having options for people to kind of come out. We talked to a lot of people who, when we asked them, who are you out to, there were people they actually kind of weren't sure about, where people said, well, I know this person follows me on Twitter, and I know I retweet a lot of stuff about queer things, but they've never said anything to me about it, and I've never said anything to them about it, so we're not really sure. And so we have, in particular with one character, Alyssa, who's a trans woman, there is a situation where you can accidentally post a photo to the wrong page and then delete it real fast, but people message you about it, and you can choose, do you just come out to them? Do you play it off as a joke? Do you not ignore ignore the message and let them think what they think, etc.? Because we kind of wanted to see the complexity of that decision, because we often see coming out as just like, you tell everyone you know on this date, and then you move on with your life, and that's not how it works for most people. Also, we mentioned the mechanic, maybe we didn't, but throughout our game, we have a couple major conflicts, and that decides the transition between characters, where you can kind of side with one person or the other who are getting in an argument in the group, and you play next as the person you side with. But we wanted to give people varying intensity when choosing a side, because that's what people do naturally, but also there is a lot of complexity around these big issues. So for example, we have a religion context where one of our characters, Soleil, posts a picture of herself in this handmade sexy priest costume for Halloween, and the caption is a bastardized version of the Apostles' Creed, and it's a lot. And so the general thought is that if you say that was fine to post, you play as Soleil next. And if you say that was not fine to post, you play as Alyssa next. But we did want to get kind of into the complexity of that, because the character you are playing as at the time, Antoine, is talking to one of his friends, like via Messenger, about this. So, at the extremes we have the Catholic Church has historically been oppressive to queer people. They are awful and they deserve what they get. And then that's totally offensive, and I'm going to comment and call her out for being totally offensive. And then kind of when we move in, we have, how offensive is this really? It's probably a little in bad taste, but it's fine. And I didn't like that you posted that in this group, but I don't think it's worth getting into an argument on the internet with someone I don't even know in real life. And then towards the middle, you have, maybe that was not in good taste, but it's so funny. And so because of that, I'm going to like this post and I'm going to leave it. And you have, I wasn't bothered by this personally, but I think to post something like that in a group for queer people and just assume it's okay with everyone is unfair. So you kind of, when you're having this conversation, we wanted people to be able to pick the thing that they would actually say in real life, but it is mechanically kind of one side or the other. So, how can you do it? We really want to think about, obviously we were doing this on a research grant, so there's lots of flights and hotels and talking to lots of people. But we wanted to talk about how can you do this on a smaller scale, because you can. And also, our game, our research question and our topic was like creating better representation. So that was the focus of our game. But you can have good representation without saying, I'm going to make a game specifically to represent people who aren't represented. And so our big thing is do some research and talk to some people, preferably people you don't know. Friends are fine for informal questions, but talking to people you know is potentially impacts the questions you ask them, and it almost definitely impacts the answers they give you. So it can be good if you can to, even if it's just 3 or 4 people, find some strangers.
Yeah, but where do you find these strangers? So for us, one of the biggest resources was local community centers, where just even knowing what city we were going to, there were a lot of steps we could take as far as contacting city centers or school centers, and usually even if they couldn't point us to specific people or forward our information, they could point us in the right direction and knew what other groups would be interested in this or what other groups we could go to. Additionally, we had a lot of success with online communities where Twitter and Tumblr are great. We ended up interviewing a few people on Reddit after we had finished our traveling because we wanted to talk to more people from the Midwest, and we found that people were very responsive and also represented a very different kind of subsection of the people we were interviewing in person, where they would be more involved in online communities and less with schools, so that was also filling in those gaps. But one of the most important things to remember when talking to these communities is to be respectful. So we have a few kind of guidelines that we've laid out, where the first thing to find out if the community has any rules about surveys or interview requests, where in Reddit this will usually be on the sidebar, and Facebook this could be a pinned moderator post. For community centers, a lot of the times they'll send out a newsletter on a certain day, so then it's just scheduling to know when that goes out or what systems are in place for this process.
Secondly, being intentional with your language. Obviously, tone is really important whenever you're reaching out to people and asking them to give you their time, presumably for free, unless you have funding to pay them. And also just being careful about affinity-based language and things like that. Sometimes coming off really casual and like kind of using those terms seems like it'll make people feel kind of more endeared to you, but it is possible to get it wrong, and then you've potentially made someone feel excluded and really awkward. So sometimes less is more with that type of thing, especially since when your tone is really casual, and we'll get into this later, it's often easy to accidentally leave out information people need to know.
Yeah. So then, additionally, explain what you were trying to accomplish with your project. This is an extremely easy step, but it's also extremely easy to overlook, where there is a reason you are going to all this effort. If it is a moral good, if it's a greater good, if it's some kind of advocate or something you want changed, there's a reason you're putting all this time and energy into it, where it is huge that you communicate that, where a lot of our interviewees did not care about video games at all and did not play them, but then we'd talk to them and they would talk about really relating to our idea of wanting to improve representation, or really being frustrated with representation in literature or movies, where if you can kind of outline at a very basic level why this matters to you, that can go a really long way as far as people volunteering their time. Additionally, be clear about what you need from your interviewees, where this is by far the easiest way to drive people away, or if not drive them away, at least not have them participate. Time, it seems pretty simple. I think a lot of people will tend to not list the time explicitly for fear of driving people away, where they don't want to say it's going to be 1 or 2 hours, but saying that explicitly is far better than people assuming it's going to be 3 or 4. And not either having the time for it or not even asking because they assume they won't be able to do it. Additionally, accessibility is a really big thing. If you're doing in-person interviews, where are they going to be located? Is it near public transportation? For us, we had the luxury of, we were traveling, so we kind of defaulted to wherever the interviewee felt most comfortable, and that was really successful. But we also definitely struggled with this, where for one of our interviews, we were interviewing a person with a vision impairment, where during our interviews, we had a consent form they would read and sign, but we hadn't said that explicitly anywhere. So this ended up being a major problem because they couldn't actually read the small print. Where then in the future, we realized we added a checkbox on the survey. If you had a vision impairment, we can provide a digital version or bigger typeface. And then we also allowed for just asking for any additional accessibilities, where it's a very simple thing, but again, very easy to overlook. Finally, the types of questions you're going to be asking, where there's a lot of sensitive topics that can come up as far as sexuality or trauma or family history, where again, I think people will shy away from this, not wanting to drive people away, when in actuality it's far better to state this explicitly, where even if you are asking a lot of hard questions, if you say that outright, that you will be asking these difficult questions, you're giving people time to prepare and actually be able to answer these questions to the best of their ability.
Okay, so we have a few real world examples, things that various groups have received or have gone out in newsletters that we want to go through and kind of just make some points and give some context to what we're saying. So this first one, I'm involved in various student groups at Northeastern, and this was one a student group had received on Facebook. It says, "Hi, I'm doing a project for my Intro to Comm Studies class about how white/het/cisgender people often expect people of minorities to perform emotional labor, often making them relive trauma when they interact with them. Is there anyone in student org who'd be happy and willing to talk about this issue? The project mostly focuses on invasive/personal questions and the cisgender/heterosexual expectation that people of minorities have to cater to them in their comfort. I'd hate to make anyone uncomfortable, and I'm very wary of falling prey to the same faults I'm describing in my work, but I believe that knowing how this expectation for emotional labor affects minorities is important to improving intercultural communication on campus. If there's anyone in your organization who feels that they can handle and are enthusiastic about this project, please email me at email or send me a message on Facebook. Thank you so much for taking the time to read this message." So to open it up to audience interaction, is there anything you feel like went wrong in this? You can just shout it out. Any thoughts?
There's no definition of like time or like location.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the big ones is what exactly do you need from us? Are these going to be interviews that you're like recording really officially? Are these just conversations over coffee? You know, are you going to publish this? Do people need to be comfortable with their names being out in the open? We don't, especially if you are specifically trying to interview queer people, there's this question about, are people who aren't out able to participate? And we just don't have any of that information for people to make a judgment call about participating in this. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay, we can go through some more. So the first one, and this one actually is kind of maybe the least obvious one, considering how this is formatted, but this is long for social media. So specifically with Facebook actually punishes Facebook pages if they don't respond to your messages right away. So if you send something like this, especially if you send it like outside of like normal business hours, you are kind of forcing an admin to engage with something that's really long and what happens there is then that lowers your chances of something actually getting out to the people it's supposed to get to over if you send this in an email and then the person can like wait until they're ready and then forward it right at that time to whoever it should go to. My second thought with this one is there's some weird language stuff here, in my opinion. The phrase people of minorities is a little off-putting, even though I admittedly can't put my finger on it, other than the fact that I personally don't really like the word minorities at all. That's like a personal thing. Just because who is a minority depends on the space, and so it feels kind of meaningless. I personally use marginalized communities, but also the tone here isn't either really clinical or casual, and I think specifically the part about if anyone feels like they can handle it and are enthusiastic, that makes me go, wait, are you doing something I can't handle? Like, should I not do this? So yeah, there's a little bit of a language issue. And then the third one we brought up already, which is that we don't know what you need from us, which kind of brings us to a bonus point. If you're contacting the leadership of an organization, include a flyer or a specific paragraph that they can forward to their people, because it shouldn't be up to them to reword your request, and they might feel uncomfortable doing that. And they're probably not gonna copy and paste a message that long, like right into a newsletter to send to people. So again, there's just more chance of it getting to the people it's supposed to get to if you make it easy for people.
So, speaking of newsletters, for a second example of this one.
How would you workshop that one? What would you do?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. I think if you want it to be this long, send it as an email.
Oh.
But you could also just make it shorter. There were things in here that didn't need to be said. I think my two biggest things would be to make it a little shorter if it's going to go on Facebook, to have information about how long, I think the things you have to have are how long are you going to publish it, and if so, where are these going to be recorded? And when you say talk to, how formal is this? So those are the things I think have to be in it. And then I think instead of if there's anyone who can handle this, just tell us if you're asking things that are sensitive and let us decide that on our own. Is there anything you'd add?
No, I don't think so. I think that covers it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our second example is kind of the opposite in a lot of ways as far as length goes. But it starts, hello there, we're looking for 21 plus years old social drinking guys who like guys, but aren't in an exclusive relationship to participate in a Brown University research study on drinking and sex. Compensation will be provided for eligible participants, as well as reimbursement for commuter rail round-trip tickets for eligible participants. So
Any thoughts on this one?
Props for funding.
Yeah, that's true.
And reimbursement for travel.
Yeah, the compensation part of this is the best part, for sure.
Also, in a lot of ways, it's kind of the only part where one of the first things for me is the intentional language, where it's casual but also very concise, so just ends up being extremely weird. Where the phrase 21 plus years old social drinking guys who like guys but aren't in an exclusive relationship feels like almost propositional to me, like instead of research. And related to that, what do you need from us? They never say what's actually going to be happening if you are a 21 plus years old social drinking guy who likes guys. You are gonna go here and do something with someone, and that's as much information as we have.
They pay you at the end, we know that
They
too.
do. So we don't know if it's interviews, if it's a research study, how long it's gonna be, what's gonna be discussed. Where
Are you expected to drink? I feel like it's something I want to know when this is...
Yeah, so a lot of key information isn't there. That is just pretty crucial if someone's deciding to participate or not.
I think, just like for thoughts about this one, other than the obvious, provide any information. I think also this is an example of what I was saying earlier, where with the casual tone really bites you because you went too far. Where like usually the phrase they use in research studies is men who have sex with men, to include gay men, bisexual men, like anyone. But the guys who like guys, like that's too much. Like, first of all, why are we using like implying romance like we're all 12? And it's actually less informative, because I would put money on the fact that what they were looking for was men who have sex with men, and they just didn't want to say that, but that's not better. Like, it's more confusing what you're actually looking for. And so then the next thought is, if you reach out to people and they're like, yes, I want to talk to you, theoretically, there's some logistics as far as like arranging the participating. So that's what this third one is. For context, this was someone had posted in the Facebook group, hey, I want people to watch my film and be like sensitivity viewers and like see if there's anything that could be offensive. And so our reviewer says, hey, if you still wanted feedback on the film sample, I'd love to help. And our creator says, hi name, thank you for reaching out about my documentary and offering to share the film with your boyfriend to give feedback. Greatly appreciated. And then they go out to say, here's the specific technical things I'm looking for feedback on, etc. And then our reviewer says, hi name, I'm actually a trans lesbian and was planning on sharing it with my NB non-binary girlfriend if that works. To which the response is, oops, I apologize. I actually copied and pasted the message I sent to another individual who wanted to share the film with their boyfriend and forgot to remove that language from the message to you. My deepest apologies for that. Yes, please feel free to share the film with your girlfriend. Please don't share beyond her. I really appreciate your feedback. Her/them, when they realize the non-binary girlfriend might use they/them pronouns. So this feels obvious, but when you're sending the same message 20 times, copying and pasting feels obvious, but just be careful. This is something that Logan and I stressed about when we were emailing people, because it would be like you're sending the same email like 10 times in the same day. But it's awkward. Like, it's so awkward. And in this case, not only is it just awkward, like when you have the wrong name, but you're actually using identity-based language that's incorrect, which that could actually not only be awkward, but make someone feel really bad. To which we get to the second point, that sometimes less is more with identity-based language, especially if you plan to copy and paste. There's just less risk. Because another thing here is, I'm pretty sure this individual had specifically asked, do you remember what they said? About if it was specifically trans people?
I think it was trans and non-binary.
Yeah, if you're looking for specifically trans people to talk to you, the chance that someone's Facebook name is not the name they go by is not insignificant. So sometimes while it can feel good to make things really personal, you're actually just putting yourself at more risk.
Yeah. So then, in conclusion, good representation matters. Talking to people equals a better understanding. If you can learn about people's personal experiences in the kind of depth and intersectionality that can just lead to more characters with more depth and more complexity. Our interviews were informed by our characters and our plot, and there were a lot of things we didn't expect going into it that we actually ended up learning from it. And thoughtful outreach equals more responses, where the last thing you want to do is drive people away from helping you with your project.
Cool. I think we were going to turn Twitch off for questions.
You want to turn it off?
Yeah. And then we can jump into Q&A.